Hello, y'all, and welcome back to the third week in a row. The last stop of this triple header following Imola and Monaco. We are in Barcelona, headed to the Spanish Grand Prix circuit. Long-time preseason testing track of the F1 calendar, and of course, it's been on the calendar for quite some time itself. So, a couple of changes this week. Mostly one permanent, one is, just kind of this week. One, it's going to be a little shorter because, well, there's not a whole lot to talk about in depth in Monaco because, well, not a whole lot happened on that circuit. Secondly, you'll notice that the graphics cluster is a little bit different on screen here, or the instrument cluster, that's the word I was looking for, because the 2025 version of the F1 game has now been released, and so that is what we are playing on and getting our first kind of laps around the circuit. Fun fact, this is the second time I'm recording this because the first time, even though I had all the same audio settings, the car was really, really, really loud and you couldn't hear talking at all over it. So we're here for the second go round. But as usual, just because there's not much to talk about with Monaco doesn't mean there's nothing to talk about with Monaco. So we will talk about the previous race weekend before we move on to what we've got coming up here for the Spanish Grand Prix. So, kind of work our way front to back as we usually do, sort of. A big weekend for Lando Norris, being able to put it on pole, win the race ahead of his teammate Oscar Piastri. Really puts the Drivers' Championship much closer together again, as Oscar had been on quite a run of form. But now between Imola and Monaco, that lead has diminished rather significantly. So we will have to see if Lando can continue that form. Looked very good for him. And then we'll head back next to P2. The hometown Monegasque Charles Leclerc made that Ferrari look pretty good on qualifying day, nearly putting it on pole, just pipped by Lando Norris. But he always goes really well around Monaco, regardless of how good that Ferrari is. And it looked like the Ferrari was decent. It was a tough weekend out for Lewis Hamilton. Obviously, the grid penalty from the impeding in qualifying really hurt him to start, put him on the back foot, and even though he was able to make a position, I believe it was, or two positions through pit strategy, it's still, he was just kind of off the pace all weekend. Or not all weekend, but in the race, he was significantly off the pace, finished some 40 seconds off the cars ahead, and wasn't particularly great. A great day for him. Max Verstappen, of course, putting that Red Bull up towards the front of the grid. Didn't quite have the best day, but he kind of was gambling on strategy throughout most of it. Starting in fourth, you wouldn't expect him to be challenging for the win unless there was the opportunity of a mega send into turn one, which, granted, Lando nearly bottled it with the huge double front lockup into turn one. He did not. He managed to hold on to the lead and go on and win that. So Verstappen was essentially playing with house money, waiting to see if a red flag would come out because of how far off the pace Lewis Hamilton was. He had 3 pit stops to make the necessary changes. The rest of the grid, not a whole lot was happening. And really the big takeaway this weekend for Monaco was the mandatory 2 pit stop strategy did not work for making anything interesting. If anything, it made it probably even a bit more of a farce, because you saw both Williams and the RB team abuse the fact that you could not overtake around Monaco, and basically used one driver to create a big enough gap for the other driver to pit into, and then flip-flopped them and did the same thing. It did result in a double points result for both of those teams, but very much to the frustration of the cars behind. The big ones being the Mercedes team, who had a really tough qualifying day, and as a result were held up by the Williams antics. So much so that I think George Russell took it upon himself to basically show how much of a farce it was by overtaking off the track, not just getting a 10-second penalty, but getting a drive-through penalty, taking that drive-through penalty and still coming out in between the two Williams cars when it was all said and done, instead of being behind both of them. So definitely, realistically, when it comes to Monaco, until there's a substantial change to the size of the cars, which we're not going to be getting next year, or some kind of change to the track itself, or some really crazy rule adjustments like a Joker lap where you're allowed to cut the chicane X number of times, Monaco is going to be Monaco. It's going to be a drive-in circle fest with no real ability to overtake unless it's raining. Rain is about the only thing that even gives the opportunity of an interesting Monaco race typically, and it's not even going to be if it's continuously raining. It's going to be if the weather conditions are changing between wets and dries and teams are having to make split-second calls to get on the right tires. So again, Monaco really not the crown jewel it was hoping to be, but alas, it's in the rearview mirror. We still do have some tracks coming up on the calendar, of course, where overtaking is very difficult. This track is, I would say, moderately difficult to overtake around, but we are past the borderline impossible to overtake section of the calendar, because Imola also very difficult to get a move done without significant tire advantages. But let's get pulled around back to the start-finish line here, and we'll take our little tour of the Spanish Grand Prix circuit as we head to it here in 2025. Of course, some quick big news while we get there. This is when the technical directive announced at the start of the year about front wing deflection tests being made more robust will come into effect, so expect lots of teams to be bringing new front wings to this circuit. We'll talk a little bit more later about what teams to really look out for, what impact that could possibly have. Let's go ahead and get parked up in the P1 grid slot. You can see we are quite a long ways from turn 1 and a little long ways down from the final corner. But let's head down into turn 1. And there's a good opportunity to slipstream on the way. You can see how much run up you get, and then of course spotting your braking zone is going to be very much critical here for the first combination of corners. It's a chicane, right, left to start. You'll typically, as we've seen many times with combination chicanes, car dive up the inside, get to the inside of the first part of the chicane, and then just straight line for the apex of the second part. Look for that kind of combination move to be done quite a lot in the overtaking opportunities around. Of course, though, lap 1, drivers are typically a little more wary of leaving space. After you've left turns 1 and 2, you're still going to be picking up speed as you sweep around the long right-hander of turn 3. Flat out, even on the higher fuel loads, you can really get hammered down, trace your way all the way to the exit of this corner for this relatively short blast down into turn 4, where you'll brake typically right around this gantry bridge and into a tight corner. We have seen attempts at moves being made in turn 4 on the opening laps, as the field is kind of bunched up. If somebody brakes earlier than because they have cars in front, you can kind of go side by side through turn 4, set yourself up on the outside of turn 4, and you may even have the opportunity to get late on the brakes, dive up the inside of this sharp downhill corner, one of the slower corners on the track at this point of turn 5. Then you're really going to see the cars find their line. They'll get sorted out typically after turn 5, because little kink of turn 6, then you have turn 7 and 8 at the bottom of this hill about to ascend it. This left-right combination, really hard to take an alternate line through the first left-hander, so it's really not an opportunity to go side by side and then work your way up the hill, exiting turn 8. Turn 9 in the modern cars, flat out, and you'll see that when we pick up the pace. But as you crest this hill, it's a fairly blind exit. You're going to pick up one of the 2 DRS zones around the track. Now, because of the speed that you carry through turn 9 and how much dirty air you're going to get from the car ahead, this DRS zone isn't really one that's designed to facilitate an overtake. It's really just there to help you close up on the car ahead. Rarely, unless there's significant tire differential, will you see cars getting enough of a run from that DRS zone to go for a move here into turn 10. Used to be a very clumsy, sharp left-hander, now has been opened up for the past few years into this long sweeping left-hander where you get the car rotated initial apex and then sweep outside, inside to set yourself up for this right-hander that is mid-speed, really stresses the front left tire, so watch out for teams looking to manage their tire temperatures around the circuit in this one. Then you get to the last 2 corners of the circuit, a flat-out right-hander as you crest the hill and start heading down. And then the final corner, which in qualifying will probably be flat out. In the race, you're going to see kind of a little lift, downshift a lot of cases. And then on to the main straight where you will open up DRS. And you'll see the kind of the best overtaking opportunity. It isn't as easy as it could be thanks to those 2 high-speed corners where you're really dependent on the downforce of the car. The dirty air will keep you a little bit at bay through those last 2 corners, but you can build up a bit of a run and try and make a move into turn 1. So while it's not as, I would say it's not as difficult as Imola or Monaco, it's still going to be quite a difficult track to get overtakes done around. And it's going to really kind of, for anywhere other than turn 1, come down to getting the right tire strategy and creating those performance offsets from the cars around you. Now, speaking of tire strategy, unlike some of the other races where we've gone steps softer in the compounds, we retain the same set of compounds that we've had for the past few years here, which are the hardest of the Pirelli range, the C1, C2, and C3 tire. And you can see there's a lot of stress being put on the tires around this circuit at a full speed lap, so they typically need the hardest compounds in order to manage that. That being said, even though they are the hardest compounds in the range, we've fairly consistently, in this regulation set, seen it be a 2-stop as the ideal pit strategy around the Spanish Grand Prix circuit. That being said, we have seen last year some teams that went soft, medium, soft as their 2-stop strategy, so it's possible that if the modern cars do seem to be managing the tires just a little bit better, the current cars compared to previous years, and letting them last a little longer, we may see some teams gamble on a 1-stop strategy, probably a medium and a hard, but really practice will tell us what we expect to see around there. I know we've seen just about every combination of strategies when it comes to the 2-stop across the teams over the last 2 years, using all 3 compounds. So it'll be interesting to see what teams utilize in this one. And as mentioned before, obviously the big thing is going to be what teams are most affected by the front wing regulation or the technical directive change that's measuring how much the front wing deflects under load. So typically teams are going to be very clever because you can't make something infinitely rigid. It's just not possible. But teams are very clever about, especially on straights, having that front wing kind of bend backwards and out of the way of the airflow to help reduce the drag when you're in a straight. And then, of course, when your speed decreases and there's less aero load on that wing, it pops back up. It's now more upright, providing more downforce at the cost of drag. Those static tests that they've done have been adjusted to increase the, or increase the tightness of that range, so the wing can move less now. I know that Red Bull would like to believe that McLaren was one of the teams really taking advantage of that flexi wing. Time will tell now that those regulation changes are coming into effect, but I believe most teams are going to be bringing a new front wing this weekend to the Spanish Grand Prix. Now, as far as we talk about things to look out for this weekend, obviously McLaren is always something to keep an eye on for, being the leaders of both the drivers and constructors championships. Lando Norris had a very good weekend in Monaco, and on the back of a decent weekend in Imola. There's 2 weekends where Lando Norris has gotten ahead of his teammate Oscar Piastri and has helped him really close the championship gap up quite significantly over those 2 race weekends. Will Spain see more of that trend? Is Lando Norris kind of getting on the horse here and establishing the fact that he is a much more experienced driver than his teammate? And can he continue this run, or will Oscar Piastri bounce back and take the opportunity, beat his teammate again, grow that championship gap as we start to creep up towards the halfway point of the season, and Max Verstappen continues to hang around? McLaren's going to have to make a choice of who they want to back before the end. Obviously, speaking of Max Verstappen and that Red Bull camp, we'll see if any of their upgrades come in and have good impacts on the car for the Spanish Grand Prix. Really, the big thing we're looking for is to see if Yuki Tsunoda is going to be able to close the gap at all to Verstappen. He came into the team having very good practice sessions compared to Verstappen, but last few weeks he's just not quite looked on it even in the practice sessions compared to Max. And that team could really use the help of a second driver to put some pressure on the McLaren duo up ahead of them. Mercedes spent most of the start of the season looking rather comfortably the second fastest car when you exclude the Verstappen Red Bull, as Red Bull is always kind of that anomaly. But it looked to be quite a manageable car to drive, and their drivers were turning in very good performances. Of course, George Russell had that streak of never being outside the top 5 in quali in a race for a substantial start to the season, but has since been outside that mark a couple of times. Has Mercedes gone down a development path that is not good, or are they just on a couple of bogey tracks that they need to get back to a more purpose-built racing circuit? I know the Mercedes has typically liked the smoother tracks, and Imola and Monaco are not that. Whereas you get a lot smoother here around the Barcelona circuit. And of course, the weather, again, is going to play a factor because that Mercedes does appear to be quite temperature sensitive. Ferrari has some upgrades in the pipeline. Of course, they brought some to Imola, and they've got new front wing coming this week. Can they make use of this change in the technical directive? Does it allow them to close the gap to the front and get a little bit more competitive with the cars ahead? I don't think it's too outrageous to say that they've got one of the more talented driver pairings on the grid, but Lewis Hamilton has not quite looked at ease and at comfort in that car, and especially kind of the mistakes that we've seen from the engineering side definitely not helping him out either. But let's see if they can get moving in the right direction. I don't expect an overnight turnaround. Williams, of course, has been very good looking for the past few races, and unless they were a team that somehow was taking advantage of the flexi wing, I wouldn't expect this technical directive to impact them too hard. We'll see if the Williams team can continue to kind of be that front of the midfield runners and continue to separate themselves. Near Williams, we saw another good weekend from the RB team. A decent weekend for Liam Lawson as well. after having some trouble this season so far. Isaac Hadjar has, continued to put in his consistently good performances, but Liam Lawson had a pretty decent weekend in Monaco, scoring some points. Although I think the strategy definitely helped that one play out overall. And then, of course, you've got Aston Martin to look out for. They had that mega qualifying in Imola that put them, both drivers in Q3. Monaco, Fernando Alonso looked pretty good until his car's and power unit went kaput on him. So could it be, obviously Monaco being such a unique track, could it be that it just didn't suit the Aston Martins and we may see a return to form from what they did in Imola, and hopefully they can do it in the race itself as well. Haas looked to have a good result in Monaco as well. Esteban Ocon scored points for the team after they've been out of the points for a while and were basically dead last at Imola. So we'll see if they have something up their sleeve. Kick Sauber, the car I'm in now. Once again, not expecting a whole lot from them, but who knows. But so plenty of things to look out for as we kind of start the proper European leg of the season before the summer break comes in. We'll see who can take claim in the McLaren camp at the top of the Drivers' Championship. But thank you all for joining me once again. I will catch you guys next time. Peace.